Okay, we're back. So now, a good way to think about this timeline, right? Doing here is life today was different than when I was born and I grew up. Just like life was different after the Renaissance than it was before. So it's important to remember, I know it's a little bit tough, that the way that we live today is not, life always hasn't been this way. For instance, when I was growing up and there was no internet, right, if you had a question that you wanted answered, you would either have to talk to your teacher or your parents, or you'd have to go to a building that not too many people go to these days. It has a lot of books in it, the library. And you would have to go to the encyclopedia and pull that volume and thumb through it. Or if you were lucky enough, you would have a set of encyclopedias at home, like I did. And I love that set of encyclopedias. Sit down and just pull volumes at random and thumb through it and read through the encyclopedia. So that's what it was like, kind of over here. But, life changes throughout these different times. So in the pre-modern, believe it or not, this is where much of human history existed. Ballpark, the Renaissance was roughly about 500 years ago, right? So you can imagine this modern era being about maybe 475, 480 years long. But the bulk of human history was pre-modern. Now, a lot of people are familiar with, when we talk about history, using these abbreviations. BC, right? Anybody knows what's that stand for? That's right, before Christ. Now, AD, a lot of people say that AD stands for after death. If you think it does, guess what? You're wrong. This is Latin for anno, which is for year, and then the D is Latin for domine, which is for king. So this is the year of the king, the year of the Lord, which refers to the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Now, when we study world religions, and in fact, when you study history today, in the global age, these demarcations for history are being replaced. So, they're being replaced by BCE. Now, BCE stands for before the Common Era. And it is the same demarcation in history as BC. So it's easy to remember that BC is the same as BCE. This is really easy to remember because you can see those two initials there, right? So if you see BCE, it's the same thing as BC. And again, this is the global age we live in. Whereas since now, people from all these different cultures, right, are communicating and interacting with each other every day, we have to leave behind those terms, demarcations that would limit cultural understandings. And AD now becomes CE, which is the Common Era. So again, this is before the Common Era, and CE is Common Era. But these demarcations that you learned before still hold. Now, some terms for us to pick up. The first are absolute, ultimate, and holy. And now, oftentimes, right, people will use the word God. But we cannot always use the word God because some world religions, such as Buddhism, are non-theistic. In other words, there is no God. So then what we have to do is we have to use other terms, such as absolute and the word ultimate that we heard before, as well as holy. So these are going to be some new terms that will be picked up, right? So we won't always say God. Sometimes you hear absolute, ultimate, holy, right? And instead of God. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, another term that we'll hear is myth. Now, what does the word myth mean? Chances are when you hear this word today, it's in reference to a cultural story, kind of like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, right? And people say, oh, those are just myths. Now, that is not our definition of the word myth. The word myth, what it refers to in the context of religious studies as well as academia, what the word myth refers to, these are stories, poems, and plays from the oral tradition. Now, this is something that's really cool, really fun to think about. The oral tradition. If we go back to our timeline up here, right? When we're in the pre-modern, this is, and that's an E, the fat part of the marker, my apologies, pre-literate, right? Now, what does pre-literate mean? If we think about much of human history was before the invention of language that's written down, right? Today, like I'm doing now, writing things on the board, that's what we refer to as literacy, right? But much of human history, people had a spoken language, but they didn't have a written language. So what that's called, it's the oral tradition. So what does the oral tradition refer to? It's that part of human history that is pre-literate. Now, what's interesting, we can kind of tie this together. One of the key inventions during the Renaissance was the printing press, which gave people the ability to rapidly stamp pages and make books. Now, before the invention of the printing press, they had books, right? But believe it or not, guess what they had to do in order to make a book? They had to copy it by hand. Can you believe that? Taking a Bible and copying out word for word, page by page, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and do that. Then that's how Bibles were made before the printing press, like over in here, right? And that's just how people had books. But then we keep going further and further and further back, and then the written language, there is no written language, there's just the oral language, people talking, right? Stories, poems, and plays, right? So oral tradition refers to pre-literacy. And we're about to time out on this lecture, so we'll pick up in the next one. So I'll be right back, y'all.